Hello there, welcome to Nerd.World Films, and today I'm doing the first in a new series which is focusing less on the movies themselves and more just on the great actors and people behind the scenes who make the movies. And I'm starting with possibly the ultimate screen legend, at least in my opinion. Grew up with this guy, love him. I'd even go as far as say he was probably one of my earliest crushes. And I'm not gay. That's how awesome he is. Arnold Schwarzenegger, or Arnold Braunschweiger, Arnold Stone, as they once wanted to call him. And let's talk about where he began, where he is now, and all the steps in between. Before we get started, if you like this channel, if you like this video when you've watched it, please watch it all the way to the end if you are liking it. Please like, share, subscribe, comment down below, as it all helps the channel grow. And also check out my other two channels, Nerd.World and Nerd.World History. Nerd.World is very similar to this channel, it's just more about television and other cult topics. And Nerd.World History is exactly what it sounds, it's about historical topics. People and events and things from history that interest me, that I want to talk about. With that said, all that out of the way, all the shameless self-promoting, let's just get started on the life and career of Arnold Schwarzenegger. And of course, the biography of Arnold Schwarzenegger would not be complete without covering his many movies, which we will go through. I don't know about all of them, but we'll definitely go through them. But we're going to start with his earlier career, his earlier life, where he was born, and how he came to be a governor, the governator, and a symbol to so many people, an inspiration to so many people around the world, not just in his native homeland, but also across the globe. Arnold Schwarzenegger was born in 1947 in Austria to his parents, Aurelia and Gustav Schwarzenegger. Sorry if I'm butchering pronunciations, I'm doing my best to try and do them. His father was a police officer and a voluntary member, and we shouldn't hold this in any way against Arnold Schwarzenegger. He was a member of the Nazi Party, which he joined in 1938. He was later at the Battle of Stalingrad, where he was injured and discharged in 1943. He married Arnold's mother in 1945, and little Arnold came bouncing along a couple of years later. As I said, we shouldn't hold that against him. That bit of information actually came out because of the now legendary rivalry, which we'll get to, between Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone, who, in a constant back and forth between the two, shall we put it, were constantly trying to dig up dirt on one another and smear each other and make each other look bad. And that happened for probably about 20 years, ongoing feud. As a young boy, Arnold was academically considered average, but was very cheerful, outgoing, and very interpersonable and funny. Hardly surprising considering the charming, charismatic man he would grow up to be. His father, however, was ill-tempered with him and showed very little patience towards him, supposedly favouring his older brother. This, of course, is all statements made by Arnold himself, but he did state that he was very close to his mother until her death. His older brother died in a car accident in 1971, leaving Arnold's nephew, his biological child, whom Arnold would pay for his education and later the move to the US of the young man. Now, this speaks to me a lot of his character. Now, obviously, skipping through a few years, Arnold takes an interest in bodybuilding and begins training continuously, showing an element of perseverance in his personality, a single-minded determination to achieve. He wanted to be Mr. Universe, a goal he would eventually achieve. He would build up his upper body, although he did once state that when he went to a contest, they noted that his upper body was outstanding, but his legs left something to be desired, so he went away and he worked constantly trying to build up his leg muscles to make his legs more in proportion with his upper body, making him the living human Adonis of a god that he basically is now. Did I say that out loud? I did. I stand by it. During his bodybuilding career, Arnold would become Mr. Olympia, incidentally becoming the youngest ever Mr. Olympia at age 23, the previous year having lost the competition but coming back in 1970 to actually win it. Now, I'm not going to go through all of his accolades. I'm just going to put it on screen, all the things he kind of did as a bodybuilder. So there. But he is considered one of the greatest bodybuilders, and his contributions to the world of bodybuilding and health and fitness can't be underestimated. He to this day still contributes a great deal to that world, and sponsored and has sponsored previously many people to get into the sport and to help them in their lives in relation to it. Then from there we move on to his early film roles. Particularly, let's start with Pumping Iron. Pumping Iron was released in 1977 and would also star the future Incredible Hulk himself, Lou Ferrigno, who was for a time Arnold Schwarzenegger's rival. But it's often said because Lou Ferrigno was a very insular man, much more quiet, whereas Arnie was very outgoing and very interpersonable. It helped his career along, whereas it somewhat held Ferrigno's career back. This was just a documentary movie, but it did put him in the spotlight and it got him noticed, and eventually led to bigger and better Hercules in New York, starring Arnold Strong. That doesn't sound right, does it? Hercules in New York is Arnie's first real cinematic movie, as I say cinematic, his first movie, where he literally plays Hercules. But his accent was so thick and his English so poor, they dubbed over him with an American voice. So he doesn't speak throughout the entire film. That is until much more recently, when re-releases of the film on DVD, where it's been once again put back to being Arnold Schwarzenegger and not Arnold Strong, his original audio has been put back in replace of the dubbing. And it is hilarious. Either way you watch it, it's hilarious. And it's a very low budget, but very kind of dumb movie. Over the next decade, he would go on to play a series of minor roles in TV movies and TV series, until eventually we reach 1982, and he lands the role of his lifetime, Conan in Conan the Barbarian. A role which would define him as an 80s action hero and sex symbol, as well as one of the leading men in Hollywood and highest paid actors of all time. That film was followed in pretty quick succession by Conan the Destroyer, The Terminator, Red Sonja, and Commando. Arnie's defining decade was the 80s. Of course, The Terminator is a film which he's very legendary for, where he actually had a hand at playing the villain. And it's not a role you often saw him in. Now, originally, Arnie was actually up for the hero role in that film, but he found the role of the Terminator far more appealing, and he spoke to James Cameron and others and said that he'd really like to play the Terminator, because it's quite famous that the original plan for the Terminator was to be someone that could just fit into a crowd and disappear, not a giant hulking god of a man like Arnie. But he persuaded him, and my god, did he knock that way out of the park, that role. Red Sonja, the character he played in that, it was sort of a spiritual sequel almost to Conan. Now, it's not a true sequel to Conan, of course, which apparently is coming soon, a third Conan movie. There were originally meant to be 3, there was a trilogy planned. But he played a very similar character made just a year later, in 1985. I, as a child, used to think that was another Conan movie, and it really confused me that it wasn't, because he was basically playing the same dude, and he just wasn't the same dude. After that, there was Raw Deal, a slightly less well received and remembered movie, but still a good film. But after that, the next movie was Predator, possibly to many people the defining role of his career, up there with Terminator. I mean, flip a coin, which is better, Predator, Terminator? Predator versus Terminator, the comic book's also good. And after that, of course, you have The Running Man, another achievement in his career, very well remembered, sort of cyberpunk movie that's just fantastic. But then he decided he was going to spread his wings, move into something a bit different, move away from the action man genre and try and do something a little different, and we get Twins, his first attempt at sort of oddball comedy, which worked with sort of Arnie's, should we call it, range, and relative deadpan delivery, juxtaposed against that charm and wit and just pure humour and delight that is Danny DeVito. The film is brilliant. And that was just a slew of successes. He was continuing to try and spread his wings in his next foray, which was an episode of Tales from the Crypt, where he actually spread his wings and attempted directing. And he directed an episode of that, which was a very successful early 90s series, one I remember. And I remember him appearing in it. I remember watching it very late at night, and there's the Crypt Keeper trying to lift some weights, and suddenly Arnie's just over him, telling him to go faster, skinny little man, work harder at it. And at the end of the episode, the Crypt Keeper's eating soup out of his skull or something, so he got that. After the success of that movie, we see a return to the genre that made him the sci-fi action man genre in Total Recall, the truly spectacular visual delight that is that film. And then he goes another attempt at comedy in Kindergarten Cop, which starts out as a stereotypical action film with him blowing stuff up and shooting people, only for you to see the gentler side. It's not as good as Twins, but I won't say it's a bad movie. It's not Mr. Nanny or anything, is it? So, From there, again, he decided to once again reprise the role that really launched his career after Conan, which was the Terminator, but this time he flipped it on his head. He's the good guy. He's a good Terminator in Terminator 2 Judgment Day. And that film needs nothing. It'll probably get its own Nerd Talks at some point. Fantastic film. It is, however, after the success of Terminator 2, we start to see the beginnings of what might be the fall of greatness, a little bit. His next big blockbuster attempt was Last Action Hero, that is actually quite a good film, but was fairly poorly received at the time for its blend of being an action comedy, which was less common, but was becoming a thing in the early 90s. He would then do True Lies, and then Junior, another pure comedy, which bombed, although True Lies didn't, starring a very young Elijah Dushku, as well as other very famous faces, and spawning a lot of very, very famous scenes from that film. True Lies is actually pretty good. But Junior, let's not pretend that it's good, shall we not? He then did Eraser, which is another underrated film, trying to go back to his roots of being a much more action-centric character. But then he descends back again into comedy with Jingle All the Way and Batman Forever, that I'm going to call a comedy, but I'm not going to comment on that one. Batman and Robin is its own thing. End of Days, another good film, on the eve of the millennium, 1999. Actually, a very good, quite dark fantasy, action, horror-ish film. From there, we see again films like The Sixth Day, another pretty decent movie, but you see a series of diminishing returns from these films. Sixth Day, where it's basically more than one Arnold. Collateral Damage, another film that's again slowly going down, and you get to Terminator 3, which should have been his great comeback, return to the role that made his career, Rise of the Machines, with a little too much comedy in it, but now having a female, well, if you want to call it female Terminators, aren't really got a gender, but a female Terminator in the TX. Not as bad a film as you people really remember it to be, but again, it's got a little too much comedy in it. And then he starts making more and more smaller roles, as this is the beginning of his move into politics, which we'll get to later. We'll just finish up with his movie roles. He has minor roles in films like The Expendables, and you begin to see more and more almost direct-to-DVD movies starting to come out around this time. It's around this time, after his political career, as I said, has pretty much ended, you start to see him doing, as I said, more TV movies. But you also see him then return to the big franchise that got him started. Starting with Terminator Genesis, which was a disaster. Terrible film, Genesis. As well as the more recent one, Terminator Dark Fate, which isn't as bad as people rag on it. It sort of got a lot of negative press for its SJW input, but generally it's not as bad as people think. It's not as bad. Go back and rewatch it. It's not as bad as you remember. It's just not as good as the others. Even Salvation's better. Genesis is not. It's a lot better than Terminator Genesis. And now he's also returning to those franchises again with The Legend of Conan and Triplets, both of which are sequels to earlier films he made back in the 80s, back in his true heyday of his career. But that's where his movie career is currently at. He's even started appearing in some TV series. And of course, he's appeared as himself and other things multiple times. And now is quite a social media presence on Instagram and Twitter. And still holds a lot of clout, not just for being formerly the governor of California, but also for just being Arnold frickin' Schwarzenegger. Now going back to his political career, Arnold, despite not being born an American, is now an American citizen and has all the rights that come with that, with the only exception being he can't run for president as he's not several generations American. However, he was able to run for governor of California, which he did for a term. Now, as at the time when he was governor, a friend of mine lived in California, an American friend of mine, and she was from California, and she told me actually not that great. She had pretty negative views as him as the governor, or the governator. But she liked him as an actor and as a man, but she didn't think much of him as a governor, thinking a lot of his policies were not great. So there was clearly mixed views. As an outsider looking in, it was funny to see the Terminator as governor of California. You just thought, you're just one step away from Skynet, you're asking for disaster. Alright. But I was wrong. There was never a robot uprising. But he was, shall we say, had middling views of him as the governor of California. But I didn't live there, I can't really comment on it, so I'm not going to. This isn't about politics. Whether he did a good or a bad job, he did the job. And he was governor. Later, he returned to acting, and he's continued to do that, as well as I said, having a nice social media presence, as do his son and daughter, also quite large Instagram personalities. Now, as I said at the beginning of the video, Arnold Schwarzenegger's had a much publicized beef with Sylvester Stallone over the years. Now, that beef has turned into something of a historical footnote and is kind of funny now in hindsight, whether or not the two of them actually dislike each other, whether it was for, majority of it was for publicity, or whether they have got over it. I don't really care. But they might have done, they might not have done. They seem to be able to work together now, which is something in the past they, probably because of their paychecks more than anything, they weren't able to do. That's why he had to wait to films like The Expendables to see them work together. But there was, as I said, a much publicised beef between the two, where they were always insulting one another, always trying to find dirt on one another, and this went on for about 20 years, as the two titans of Hollywood clashed, like gods amongst men upon the Olympus of Hollywood. Now, that's really ancient history now, and I'm not going to go into all the stuff about his family. He has kids, he's been married a few times, he has a reputation of being a womanizer and a bit of a philanderer. He's only human, no one's expecting him to be perfect. Now, I'm not going to get into all of that because it's his personal life, it's his business. Google it. I'm more interested in his contribution to movies and the world of entertainment. And in that regard, he is truly, genuinely a superstar. He may have even been one of the definers of that term. And he's still going strong today. His films may not be the draws they once were. They may not be pulling in so many views. They might not become the cult hits like Predator that they once did become, but they're still good. He's become a talented and rounded individual who's done a lot for his country, Austria and America. He's done a lot for other people, supporting them in their industry, supporting them in their careers, sponsoring many young other actors and up-and-comers. For that, he should be thanked. He should be patted on the back and said, well done, Arnold. He's still active politically, recently, as of 2020 and 2021, voicing his personal opinion on the Trump administration, which again, politics we're not getting into, he's entitled to his opinion, just as you are, as anyone else is. And there is the life of Arnold Schwarzenegger, one of the titans of Hollywood. His rise and not downfall, but retirement, shall we call it. His easing in later life. I hope you liked the video. I hope you learned about Arnold Schwarzenegger. I hope you like Arnold Schwarzenegger. Tell me in the comments below. Suggest another actor. I'm probably going to try and go through all the 80s giants. Suggest someone else, actor or an actress, who you'd like to see. And please like, share, subscribe. And again, comment down below. And bye-bye.